Dawn, April 1, 1945. A low gray mist hangs over the East China Sea. The water is unnaturally calm. A young Japanese artillery observer, perched in a hidden cave on the cliffs of Hagushi Bay. Okinawa rubs the sleep from his eyes. He scans the horizon, empty. Then a low rumble disturbs the stillness, not from the sky, but from the sea itself. The horizon begins to darken, not with clouds, but with ships, more ships than he has ever seen, more than he could have imagined, a forest of steel masts and gun barrels. Growing, spreading, until it blots out the entire seam between ocean and sky. The rumble deepens into a continuous, earth-shaking tremor. He fumbles for his field telephone, his voice a choked whisper, then a scream. Before the words can leave his lips, the world erupts, the first salvo of naval shells. Screams overhead, a sound like tearing canvas. The seaward cliffs of Okinawa vanish in a rolling tsunami of fire and dirt. The very island seems to shudder on its foundations. In his fortified headquarters at Shuri Castle, miles from the coast, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima receives the report. He remains still, calm. This is the storm they had prepared for. His defenses are deep, his troops disciplined. The beaches are a death trap. Let them come. Out in the bay, the first waves of American landing craft lower their ramps. Thousands of men wade onto the sand. They brace for a hail of machine gun fire, for the crump of mortars, for the fanatical resistance intelligence had promised. None comes. The only sound is the distant thunder of the naval guns and the wind. The beaches are eerily, terrifyingly empty. The American landing, one of the largest amphibious assaults in history, is unopposed. For the men on the sand, it is a miracle. For General Ushijima, it is the first deliberate move in a deeper, more brutal game. The real battle for Okinawa has not yet begun. It is waiting patiently in the labyrinth of caves and hills to the south. This opening establishes the surreal and ominous calm of the initial landing, creating immediate tension. The stage is now set to explore the strategic situation that led to this moment. By the spring of 1945, the once vast Pacific Empire of Japan was contracting under immense pressure. The American island-hopping campaign had severed its vital supply lines, bringing U.S. forces ever closer to the home islands. The capture of Iwo Jima in March, after a month of brutal combat, provided a crucial emergency landing strip for B-29 bombers, but it was not a suitable staging ground for a full-scale invasion of Japan itself. For that, a larger, more strategically located island was needed. Okinawa. The largest of the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa was administratively part of Japan, but its people and culture were distinct. It lay just 350 miles south of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. To American strategists, it was the final stepping stone. Its capture would provide the fleet anchorages, airfields, and logistical bases necessary to launch Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. For the United States, Okinawa was the anvil upon which Japan's fate would be forged. For Imperial Japan, Okinawa was the final defensive bulwark. Its loss would mean the end of any credible defensive perimeter, exposing the homeland to direct invasion and total blockade. The Japanese High Command understood this with chilling clarity. The battle for Okinawa would not be a repeat of Tarawa or Iwo Jima, large-scale battles of attrition fought for small, isolated specks of land. This would be a battle for national survival, fought on what was considered sovereign Japanese soil. The man tasked with the island's defense was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. Calm, methodical officer of the old Imperial Japanese Army School, he commanded the newly formed 32nd Army, unlike the fanatical commanders on Iwo Jima who believed in defeating the enemy at the water's edge. Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, were realists. They had studied the American way of war and understood the futility of trying to stop their overwhelming naval and aerial firepower on the beaches. Instead, they devised a new doctrine, a defense in depth. They would let the Americans come ashore, let them pour their men and material onto the island, and then, from a series of intricate, mutually supporting defensive lines carved into the ancient limestone hills of southern Okinawa, they would bleed them White, the key was attrition. The goal was not to win a tactical victory, but to inflict such staggering casualties that the American public's will to continue the war would break. They would make Okinawa so costly that Washington would seek a negotiated peace, rather than face the prospect of invading the main islands. To this end, they transformed Okinawa into a fortress. The Shuri Castle area, located south of the capital Naha, became the heart of their defense. This was not a single castle but a complex of ridges, escarpments, and hills honeycombed with caves, tunnels, and concrete emplacements. Natural caves were expanded and connected by a network of tunnels spanning miles. Artillery was positioned in recessed caves with narrow firing ports immune to all but a direct hit. Mortar pits, machine gun nests, and bunkers were all interlocked with fields of fire meticulously calculated to create killing zones. The landscape itself was weaponized. Yet as the sun rose on that April Fool's Day, the American landing force, known as the 10th Army under General Simon Bolivar Buckner, saw none of this. They saw only empty beaches. Ushijima's master plan was already in motion, his army lying in wait, blades sheathed in the earth, ready to be drawn. This first part of the context establishes the strategic importance of Okinawa for both sides and introduces the core Japanese defensive strategy. The stage is now set to examine the American plan and the immense force assembled for the invasion. Facing Ushijima's deeply entrenched 32nd Army was the largest and most powerful amphibious force ever assembled in the Pacific Theater, codenamed Operation Iceberg. The invasion fleet was under the overall command of Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet. Its scale was almost incomprehensible, over 1,300 ships from massive fleet carriers and battleships to humble landing craft converged on the Rukius. This armada carried more than 180,000 combat troops of the newly formed 10th Army, led by Army General Simon Bolivar Buckner. The 10th Army itself was a unique entity, a combined force of two corps. The III Amphibious Corps, under Major General Roy Geiger, was comprised of the battle-hardened veterans of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, men who had fought their way across the bitter landscapes of Peleliu and Guam. The XXIV Army Corps, under Major General John R. Hodge, contained the 7th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions, seasoned soldiers from the campaigns in the Philippines. In reserve was the 2nd Marine Division and the 27th and 81st Infantry Divisions, a total strategic reserve larger than the entire invasion force of many previous operations. The American plan was deceptively straightforward, following a prolonged and massive naval and aerial bombardment. The main landings would occur on the western coast of Okinawa along the Hagushi beaches. This area was chosen for its proximity to two critical objectives, the Yontan and Kadena airfields. Capturing these fields intact was a primary D-Day goal. They would provide immediate basing for American aircraft, freeing the carriers from their vulnerable, stationary support role. Once a secure lodgment was established, the 10th Army would drive across the island, cutting it in two before turning north and south to clear the island of enemy forces. Intelligence, however, presented a troubling picture. Aerial reconnaissance and reports from submarine-launched reconnaissance teams revealed significant Japanese forces on the island, but the precise disposition of Ushijima's army remained elusive. The Americans knew of the Shuri defenses, but they underestimated their depth, complexity, and the sheer number of troops waiting in the south. There was a prevailing belief that a significant portion of the Japanese army was positioned in the rugged jungle clad Yanbaru region in the north, and that the Shuri Line, while formidable, could be broken by a determined, direct assault. For 10 days prior to the landing, the fleet unleashed a storm of steel upon Okinawa. Battleships like the USS Iowa and USS New Jersey steamed close to shore, their 16-inch guns firing shells the weight of small cars, each impact capable of obliterating a city. Block cruisers and destroyers added their own weight of fire from the decks of aircraft. Carriers, Hellcat, and Corsair fighters and dive bombers screamed inland, striking at gun emplacements, troop concentrations, and airfields. The bombardment was designed to pulverize the coastal defenses, clear beach obstacles, and shatter the morale of the defenders. Yet as the shells and bombs churned the earth, they had little effect on Ushijima's main force. Safely ensconced in their deep, reinforced caves and tunnels, the soldiers of the 32nd Army waited. The thunderous bombardment was a signal, not a threat. They heard the naval guns and knew what was coming. The Americans were expending their fury on empty positions, on dummy installations, on the vacant beaches themselves. The real strength of the Japanese army was preserved, untouched, its commanders patiently observing the unfolding spectacle, confident in their strategy. The stage was set not for the battle the Americans had planned, but for the one the Japanese had meticulously prepared. The context is now fully established, revealing the clash between American overwhelming force and Japanese deeply entrenched strategy. To understand the dynamics of the coming battle, we must now view it from multiple perspectives. In his subterranean headquarters, beneath the medieval stones of Shuri Castle, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima embodied a new kind of Japanese warfare. He was not a firebrand, but a stoic and calculating samurai. His command post was a world away from the chaos of the surface, a complex of humid, electrically lit tunnels, map rooms, and communication centers, all buzzing with a quiet, determined activity. Ushijima's strategy, codified in the Battle of Attrition instruction manual, was a radical departure from the Jyokusai, the honorable death, mentality that had consumed other commands. His philosophy was simple: a cornered rat will bite a cat. The cornerstone of this strategy was the Shuri defense line. This was not a single trench, but a series of concentric, fortified positions running across the waste of southern Okinawa. It leveraged every topographical advantage. Key points like Kakazu Ridge, the Mita Escarpment, and Shuri itself formed strongpoints, each a fortress in its own right. They were interconnected by tunnels, allowing troops and supplies to move safely and enabling counterattacking forces to materialize seemingly from nowhere. Artillery was the linchpin. Guns were hidden in caves with carefully engineered firing ports. After firing a few rounds, they would be rolled back deep into the caves on railway tracks, safe from counter-battery fire. The entire defense was a masterclass in reverse-slope tactics, positioning forces on the backside of hills to remain hidden from naval observation and direct fire. To sell the deception of a main defense in the north, Ushijima deployed the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade and a regiment of the 62nd Division into the Yambaru, the wild, mountainous northern region. They constructed dummy positions and made enough radio traffic to convince American intelligence that a significant force was present. This feint was devastatingly effective. It would draw precious American resources and time away from the main event in the south, buying Ushijima's main army more time to exact its bloody toll. Every day the Americans spent securing the north was a day the Shuri Line grew stronger. If Ushijima was the mind of the defense, Admiral Raymond Spruance was the architect of the assault. Aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, Spruance commanded the most powerful naval force in history. The Fifth Fleet was a floating nation of steel, firepower, and logistics. Its mission was twofold: to deliver the 10th Army to Okinawa and to keep it supplied, and to establish naval and air superiority across the entire region. The fleet was a layered instrument of war. At its core were the attack force transports, carrying the men and equipment of the invasion. Protecting them was a vast screen of destroyers, cruisers, and the workhorse escort carriers providing close air support. Further out were the fast carrier task forces, TF-58, under the aggressive Admiral Mark Mitcher. These fleets of large carriers, screened by fast battleships, were the strategic shield and sword. Their job was to neutralize Japanese air power on Formosa and in the home islands, and to intercept any naval threat. And that threat was real. Waiting in the inland sea was the last great symbol of Japanese naval power, the super battleship Yamato, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. She was a floating fortress. Spruance's battleships, the modernized veterans of Pearl Harbor, were poised for a classic gunnery line engagement should Yamato sortie, but Spruance's primary concern was not surface action. It was the kamikaze, intelligence warned of a new, terrifying level of Japanese air resistance, a planned floating chrysanthemum of suicide attacks aimed at sinking the fleet anchored off Okinawa. For Spruance, the battle would not be just for the island, but for the survival of his ships in the surrounding seas, a fight against an enemy willing to turn their own aircraft into guided missiles. These two opposing forces, one dug deep into the earth, the other a colossal armada, on the sea were on a collision course, dictated by their commanders, starkly different doctrines. The Americans planned for a swift, violent seizure. The Japanese planned for a long, slow bleed-out. The true nature of the conflict was about to be revealed not on the beaches but in the skies above the fleet and the ridges of southern Okinawa. The first two angles have established the core command philosophies. We will now explore the brutal realities of the kamikaze threat, the unprecedented naval bombardment, and the often overlooked plight of the Okinawan civilians. The battle for Okinawa was fought in two distinct, yet horrifically interconnected dimensions. On land, it was a brutal, grinding infantry war of attrition. At sea, it was a desperate, high-tech battle against a pre-modern, sacrificial enemy. This was the schizophrenic reality for the American forces, fighting a 20th-century war on the ground, while facing a form of warfare not seen for centuries on the water. The kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum, operations were the systematic massed kamikaze attacks ordered by the Imperial Japanese Navy, beginning just days after the landings. These waves involved hundreds of aircraft, a mix of conventional bombers and fighters and specially designed, explosive-laden suicide planes like the Aka, a rocket-powered human-guided bomb. Their target was the American fleet, particularly the destroyers stationed on the radar picket lines, the first line of defense dozens of miles from the main anchorages. The experience for sailors on these picket ships was a unique form of hell. Stationed in isolation, they were the tripwires. For hours, they would watch the empty sky radar scope sweeping, then would come the contact, a blip, then more. The air would fill with the frantic shouts of the Combat Information Center, the blare of the general quarters alarm, and the deafening roar of every gun on the ship opening up. 5-inch shells, 14 Bofors, and 20 Oerlikons would fill the sky with a curtain of black flak. And tracers, the kamikaze pilots weaved through this storm, aiming to crash into the ship's superstructure or amidships. A successful hit was catastrophic, often causing massive fires, secondary explosions, and staggering casualties. The sea around Okinawa became a graveyard for dozens of U.S. ships, and the casualty rate among destroyer crews was second only to that of the Marines on the island. In contrast to the ethereal terror of the kamikaze, the American naval gunfire support was the embodiment of raw, industrial-age firepower. The pre-landing bombardment was just the overture, as the infantry advanced inland and encountered Ushijima's main line of defense. The battleships, cruisers, and destroyers shifted to a role of floating artillery. They became the long-range fist of the 10th Army. The call would go out from a forward observer embedded with the troops, pinned down by hidden Japanese positions. Coordinates were radioed to the ship. On the bridge, the fire control officer would plot the data. Deep in the bowels of the ship, in the powder magazines and shell rooms, sailors would manhandle the massive projectiles into the hoists. The great turrets would rotate, their long barrels elevating with hydraulic precision. Then the fire gong would sound, and the world would vanish in a concussive blast of sound and light. A salvo of 16-inch high-capacity shells, each weighing over a ton, would arc high over the heads of the Marines and soldiers, traveling for miles, before plummeting onto a single ridge or reverse slope. The impact was geological. Entire hillsides were rearranged. Japanese fortifications, thought to be impregnable, were sometimes vaporized by a direct hit. The shelling was so continuous that soldiers on the front lines grew accustomed to the constant, earth-shaking rumble. They gave the battleships nicknames, taking comfort in the deep-throated roar of the USS New Mexico or the USS Colorado. Yet, even this awesome power had its limits. Many Japanese positions, so deeply dug and cunningly recessed, survived all but a perfect hit. The naval gunfire could soften the defenses, but it could not eliminate them. That grim, final yardage always fell to the infantryman with his rifle, flamethrower and grenades. Caught in the apocalyptic crossfire between these two mighty forces were the Okinawan. People numbering around 300,000, they were the forgotten participants in the battle, whose suffering would become one of its most enduring and tragic legacies. They were not simply bystanders, they were pawns, victims, and sometimes unwilling participants. The Japanese military viewed the Okinawans with suspicion, considering them not truly Japanese and therefore of questionable loyalty. They were conscripted for labor, forced to build the very fortifications that would make their island a battlefield. As the Americans advanced, civilians were often expelled from their safe cave shelters by Japanese soldiers or found themselves trapped between the lines. They were subjected to relentless American artillery barrages and naval gunfire with no means of protection. A deep and tragic irony of the battle was the effectiveness of Japanese propaganda. For years, the Okinawans had been told that the Americans were barbarians who would torture, rape, and murder them if they were captured. This led to mass suicides, particularly at the cliffs of Marpi Point on Saipan and in countless caves across Okinawa. Families convinced death was preferable would huddle together as a grenade was detonated, or parents would kill their children before taking their own lives. Those who did try to surrender often found it difficult, as they would be shot by Japanese soldiers, who saw surrender as a contagion. For those who made it to American lines, the shock was profound. They found not barbarians, but soldiers who provided food, medical care, and safety in internment camps. But this realization came too late for tens of thousands. The civilian death toll on Okinawa would ultimately exceed 100,000, a stark testament to a population utterly consumed by the fire of war. These angles reveal the multifaceted horror of the campaign, from the sacrificial warfare at sea to the systematic destruction on land and the human cost borne by the innocent. The stage is now set for the brutal, grinding climax of the battle, the assault on the Shuri Line. The initial unnerving silence of the Hagushi beaches gave way to a rapid American advance. The Yontan and Kadena airfields were captured with stunning speed, almost intact. The 6th Marine Division turned north, embarking on a difficult but ultimately successful campaign to clear the Yanbaru Peninsula, engaging and defeating Ushijima's faint force. For the first week, it seemed as if the intelligence estimates were wrong that the Japanese defense was a paper tiger. This illusion shattered on April 8th, when the soldiers of the 96th Infantry Division, advancing southward, first encountered the outer bastions of the Shuri Line. Their initial objective was a seemingly unremarkable series of hills and ridges, the Cactus, Kakazu, and Nishibaru complexes. What they found was not a line of trenches, but a death trap. The American infantry advanced up open slopes, only to be met by storm of interlocking machine gun and mortar fire from hidden positions on the reverse slopes. As they hit the dirt, Japanese mortars, pre-registered on every inch of the terrain, walked the killing zones with horrific accuracy. Then, from dozens of hidden cave openings, Japanese infantry would launch localized counterattacks, swarming the pinned-down Americans with knee mortars, grenades, and bayonets. The fighting for Kakazu Ridge became a microcosm of the entire battle. The 96th Division's assaults were repulsed with heavy losses. Tanks sent to support the infantry were knocked out by 47 anti-tank guns firing from camouflaged positions, or by suicide attackers wielding magnetic mines and satchel charges. The American advance ground to a bloody halt. The sheer density of the Japanese defenses was now appallingly clear. This was not a line to be broken by a single courageous charge. It was a complex, multi-layered organism that had to be dismembered piece by bloody piece. General Buckner's response was methodical and, to some of his subordinate commanders, fatally slow. He rejected proposals for amphibious hooks to land behind the Shuri lines, fearing a repeat of the difficulties at Tarawa. Instead, he committed to a frontal assault, relying on what he called his blowtorch and corkscrew tactics. The blowtorch was the flamethrower used to scour cave openings. The corkscrew was high explosive satchel charges, grenades, and demolitions used to physically seal and collapse the cave systems. The battle devolved into a nightmare of close-quarter combat. squads, and platoons, became the primary units of action. A typical attack involved a grueling, day-long effort to advance a few hundred yards. It would begin with a massive artillery and naval gunfire preparation. Under this cover, infantry would scramble forward, dodging mortar and machine gun fire to get close to a cave mouth. A flamethrower operator, burdened by his heavy and highly vulnerable fuel tanks, would inch forward, his weapons spewing a napalm gel that could curl around corners and suck the oxygen from deep caves. Behind him, a demolition team would rush the opening, toss in satchel charges, and run for cover as the explosion collapsed the entrance, entombing the defenders. But for every cave sealed, 3 more revealed themselves. The Japanese network of tunnels allowed them to reoccupy positions from the rear, or to emerge from hidden spider holes behind the American advance, turning yesterday's front line into today's deadly no-man's land. The weather, as if siding with the defenders, broke in early May. Torrential rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud. Tanks bogged down, roads became impassable, the wounded lying on stretchers drowned in flooded shell holes. The landscape itself seemed to be rotting, littered with the unburied dead of both sides. The stench of death was omnipresent, a foul miasma that permeated uniforms, food, and the very air the men breathed. The Shuri Line was not just a defensive position, it was a meat grinder, consuming men and machines at a horrifying rate. The relentless, bloody stalemate at the Shuri Line defines the first phase of the climax. The American advance has been checked with terrible losses, and the battle has become a brutal war of inches in nightmarish conditions. The pressure for a decision is building to a breaking point. By mid-May, the battle had become a grotesque calculus of attrition. The 10th Army was bleeding itself white against the Shuri defenses. Casualty figures were soaring, surpassing the worst days of the First World War. In Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters saw the grinding struggle as validation of their strategy. They urged Ushijima to hold fast, to make the Americans pay for every inch. But within the Shuri headquarters, the pressure was also immense. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, Ushijima's aggressive chief of staff, argued forcefully for a major counter offensive. The constant bombardment, the loss of key outposts, and the strain on his troops were taking their toll. A bold strike, Cho argued, could shatter the American lines, destroy their forward units, and recapture lost ground, buying precious time and inflicting a psychological blow from which the Americans might not recover. The more cautious Ushijima, after weeks of relentless pressure, finally acquiesced. On the night of May 4th, under the cover of a torrential rainstorm and a massive artillery barrage, the 32nd Army launched its grand counteroffensive. It was a complex, multi-pronged attack. Waves of Japanese infantry, screaming banzai, surged out of their caves and tunnels, charging directly into the American lines. Simultaneously, amphibious units attempted landings behind American positions on both coasts. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The element of surprise was lost. American listening posts had intercepted the buildup. The frontline units, the 7th and 77th Divisions, were dug in and waiting. As the human waves emerged from the darkness, they were met by a storm of pre-sighted artillery. Mortar and machine gun fire, star shells and flares illuminated the no-man's land, turning it into a shooting gallery. The Japanese soldiers, brave to the point of fanaticism, were cut down in rows. The amphibious assaults were detected and annihilated by naval patrol craft and waiting infantry on the beaches. By the morning of May 5th, the counteroffensive had been utterly broken. The 32nd Army had suffered over 5,000 casualties, irreplaceable veteran troops for no gain. The failed attack crippled Ushijima's defensive capabilities. His reserves were decimated. The initiative passed irrevocably to the Americans. Emboldened by this defensive victory, General Buckner intensified the pressure. He funneled fresh divisions into the line, allowing exhausted units to rotate out. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, having secured the north, were brought south to relieve the battered Army divisions. The focus of the American assault shifted to the flanks of the Shuri Line. On the west, the 1st Marine Division began the grueling task of assaulting the Daikshi and Wana ridges, a maze of coral cliffs and draws that led into the heart of Shuri, on the east, the 96th and 7th Divisions renewed their attack on the Conical Hill. Yanabaru Complex. The fighting for these positions was as brutal as any in the Pacific. The Wana Draw became a valley of death, covered by machine guns from the high ground and swept by artillery. Progress was measured in feet, paid for with lives, yet the American advance, though agonizingly slow, was now inexorable. The Japanese, their strength sapped by the failed counteroffensive, could no longer mount the same ferocious local counter attacks. The final, decisive blow to the Shuri Line was not delivered by a single infantry charge, but by the relentless, grinding pressure applied across the entire front. By late May, American forces were threatening to envelop Shuri from both flanks. The capture of Conical Hill on the east and the slow, bloody progress through the draws on the west made the Shuri position untenable. Ushijima's command post was now within direct artillery range. The noose was tightening. Faced with annihilation, Ushijima made his most difficult decision. On the night of May 29th, under the cover of another monsoon downpour, he ordered a general withdrawal from the Shuri defenses. It was a masterfully conducted retrograde operation. Thousands of Japanese troops, along with their wounded and what equipment they could carry, filtered southward through the mud and rain, escaping the closing American pincer. They fell back to a final defensive line on the Kiin Peninsula, a last-ditch position centered on the Yijudake and Uzudake escarpments. On May 31st, elements of the 5th Marine Regiment cautiously entered the ruins of Shuri Castle, the ancient seat of Ryukyuan kings, now a shattered moonscape of rubble and corpses, was finally in American hands. The heart of the Japanese defense had been torn out. The capture of Shuri was the true turning point. It marked the end of organized, large-scale resistance and the beginning of the end. What remained was not a battle, but a bloody, chaotic mopping-up operation against a cornered, but still deadly, enemy. The fall of Shuri Castle breaks the back of the Japanese defense and forces a final, desperate withdrawal. The battle is won, but the killing is far from over as the remnants of the 32nd Army prepare for a last stand on the southern tip of the island. The fall of Shuri Castle did not end the fighting, but it broke the 32nd Army's cohesive defensive structure. The withdrawal south was a descent into a new circle of hell, harried by American artillery and airstrikes. The Japanese columns trudged through a landscape churned into a soupy, foul-smelling mire. The monsoon rains, which had offered cover for their escape, now became a torment. The retreat was littered with the abandoned, wounded, the dead, and shattered equipment. For the surviving Japanese soldiers, it was a march into a tightening pocket of despair. The Americans, sensing the kill, pursued with relentless pressure. General Buckner, believing the Japanese were on the verge of collapse, issued a message to General Ushijima urging him to surrender to avoid needless bloodshed. The appeal was broadcast via loudspeakers and dropped in leaflet form over the Japanese lines. It was met with stoic silence. For Ushijima and his men, surrender was not an option. Their duty now was to die well, to sell their lives as dearly as possible in the service of the emperor. The final Japanese defensive line was established across the Kiin Peninsula, the last sliver of Okinawan territory. It was a naturally strong position, centered on the parallel ridges of Yijudake and Uzudake, and honeycombed with caves, many of which contained ancient Okinawan tombs that provided perfect ready-made fortifications. Here, the remnants of the 32nd Army, a mix of organized units and leaderless stragglers, dug in for their final stand. The fighting in June was characterized by a new level of desperation. Japanese resistance became more fragmented but no less fanatical. Banzai charges, which had been tactically absent during the main Shuri defense, became more common as units were overrun or chose a final glorious death. The American advance methodically compressed the Japanese pocket. It was a brutal, yard-by-yard clearance operation. Flamethrowing tanks, now the most critical weapon on the battlefield, crawled forward, blasting sheets of fire into every cave, crevice, and tomb. Demolition teams followed, sealing the entrances. Infantry mopped up the few survivors. The stench of burning fuel, cordite, and decomposing bodies was overpowering. The civilian tragedy also reached its horrifying climax. Thousands of Okinawans were trapped in the crossfire or hiding in caves with Japanese soldiers, who sometimes used them as human shields or, in the final, twisted logic of the battle, killed them to prevent their surrender. The end for the Japanese command came on June 18th from his new and final headquarters in a cave on the coast near the village of Mabuni. General Ushijima received the reports of the collapsing lines. That same day, the American command suffered a devastating blow. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, observing the front lines of the 8th Marine Regiment, was positioned just behind a ridge, a Japanese artillery spotter hidden in the hills called in a fire mission. A single 47 shell struck a coral outcrop near the general, and the resulting shrapnel tore into his chest. He died on the field just minutes later, becoming the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by enemy fire in the entire war. His death was a stark reminder that even in its death throes, the 32nd Army remained a lethal force. With the American noose drawing tight around the Mabuni headquarters, Ushijima and Cho prepared for the end. On the night of June 21st, after sharing a final, solemn meal of canned delicacies and sake, the two generals performed the ancient seppuku ritual. Dressed in their full-dress uniforms, they knelt on a blanket laid out at the mouth of their cave overlooking the sea. First, Ushijima, with calm deliberation, plunged a dagger into his abdomen. His aide-de-camp then performed the duty of kaishakunin, beheading him with a sword. General Cho followed immediately after. Their deaths formalized the end of organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. The following day, June 22nd, the American flag was raised officially over Okinawa. The island was declared secured, but the declaration was a technicality, the mopping up of bypassed Japanese holdouts and the rescue of terrified civilians from the labyrinth of caves would continue for weeks, a grim and dangerous coda to the main event. The command structures of both armies have been shattered, one by ritual suicide, the other by a sniper's shell. The organized battle is over, but the final, terrible accounting of its cost is about to begin. The silence that fell over Okinawa in late June 1945 was not the quiet of peace, but the hollow, ringing silence of utter exhaustion. The scale of the carnage was almost beyond comprehension. The 10th Army had suffered over 49,000 casualties, including more than 12,500 killed or missing. The U.S. Navy, enduring the relentless Kikusui attacks, bore a staggering burden of its own, nearly 10,000 casualties, with over 4,900 sailors killed, a higher death toll than in all previous U.S. wars combined. The fleet had lost 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged, many beyond repair. The decks of aircraft carriers, designed for combat operations, were instead used for the grisly task of scrubbing away the blood and remains of kamikaze pilots. For the Japanese 32nd Army, it was near total annihilation. Of the approximately 100,000 soldiers who had defended the island, an estimated 110,000 died. Only a few thousand surrendered or were taken prisoner in the final days. The rest fought to the death or took their own lives. The code of Bushido and the fear of what surrender might bring had proven to be a more powerful force than the instinct for survival. But the most haunting statistic, the one that truly defined the tragedy of Okinawa, was the civilian toll. Of a pre-war population of roughly 300,000, it is estimated that over 140,000 Okinawan civilians perished, fully one-third of the island's population. They died in every conceivable way, buried in collapsed caves by artillery, caught in crossfire, conscripted into suicidal frontline labor units, or coerced into killing themselves and their families by Japanese soldiers or their own propaganda-induced fear. The cultural and historical heart of the Ryukyu Islands had been systematically obliterated. Ancient castles, temples, and libraries were reduced to rubble. The landscape itself was a scarred wasteland of cratered fields, denuded hills, and splintered forests. The strategic fruits of this victory were immediately put to use. Kadena and Yontan airfields, along with newly built bases like Bolo Point, were rapidly expanded. Soon, B-29 superfortresses were operating from Okinawan runways, their flight time to the industrial cities of Japan cut in half. The fleet anchorage at Buckner Bay now Nakagusuku Bay became a bustling hub for the invasion force being assembled for Operation Downfall. Okinawa had become the anvil just as planned, but the cost of placing that anvil cast a long, dark shadow over all future planning. In Washington and at the Allied headquarters in Manila, the reports from Okinawa were studied with a sense of profound dread. If a force of 100,000 Japanese soldiers, defending a relatively small island, could inflict 72,000 total American casualties over 3 months, what would be the price of invading the Japanese home islands? Intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese could muster over 2 million soldiers and thousands of suicide aircraft and boats for the defense of Kyushu and Honshu. Projected American casualties for the first phase alone, Operation Olympic, ranged from 250,000 to over 1 million. The battle for Okinawa, rather than being the final rehearsal, had become a terrifying preview of a coming apocalypse. This grim calculus became the ultimate, unspoken legacy of the battle. It framed the most momentous decision of the 20th century, when President Harry Truman was briefed on the potential casualties for a mainland invasion, and when he learned of the successful test of a new, unimaginably powerful weapon in the New Mexico desert. The experience of Okinawa weighed heavily on his mind. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, in a tragic and indirect way, the final consequence of the bloodletting on Okinawa. The battle had demonstrated with horrific clarity that a conventional invasion of Japan would be a descent into a hell far worse than anything yet seen. It had made the unthinkable thinkable. The battle is over, and its staggering costs have been tallied, directly influencing the endgame of the Pacific War. All that remains is to step back and consider what this colossal struggle meant in the broader scope of history. The sands of the Hagushi beaches are long since washed clean. The craters on Kakazu Ridge have been softened by time and overgrowth. The rebuilt stones of Shuri Castle stand as a testament to resilience, but the silence that hangs over Okinawa is a heavy one, filled with the echoes of an almost incomprehensible sacrifice. The Battle of Okinawa was more than a military engagement. It was a collision of empires, ideologies, and human endurance at its absolute limit. It represented the brutal culmination of the Pacific War, a conflict where industrial might and tactical innovation crashed against a deeply entrenched, spiritually fortified defense. It was a battle where the very definitions of courage and sacrifice were tested and rewritten in fire and blood. For the art of war, Okinawa was a grim lesson in the terrifying efficiency of a defense in depth, a lesson that would be studied for decades to come. It showcased the terrifying potential of asymmetric warfare, from the kamikaze in the sky to the lone soldier with a satchel charge in a cave. It demonstrated that willpower could defy material superiority, even if only for a time and at a horrific cost. But beyond the tactics and the technology, Okinawa endures as a profound human tragedy. It stands as a permanent reminder of the plight of civilians trapped between mighty armies, their lives, their culture, and their future becoming mere collateral in a strategic calculation. The shared grief of American families, Japanese families, and the Okinawan people created an invisible, enduring bond, a bond forged in loss. Today, the island is a living monument. Peace Memorial Park, built on the site of the Final Command Cave at Mabuni, houses the cornerstone of peace, a vast collection of stone slabs inscribed with the names of all who died, regardless of nationality or allegiance. It is a place of powerful, silent dialogue between former enemies, united in a common hope. The battle for Okinawa secured a victory, but it also bestowed a sacred responsibility, the responsibility to remember the price, to understand the fragility of peace, and to ensure that such a harvest of death is never again reaped from the fields of war.